Every chess player has been there. You played a great game, you're up a pawn, and it all comes down to the endgame. But then you can't quite finish it off. You let a winning position slip into a draw. That's where two legendary endgame positions come in, the Lucena and the Philidor. One shows how to win when you've got the advantage, and the other one shows how you can defend like a wall when you're worse. In this video, I'll break them down so you will never be afraid of Rook Endgames again. Enjoy the video. Okay, let's start by describing what the Lucena position is. Now, Lucena position in chess is when a pawn is on the 7th rank. The defending king, which in this case is the black king, because black is the one trying to defend the position, is cut off. That's the second attribute of Lucena. And the attacking king, the one that's trying to win, in this case the white king, can be attacked by the black rook and it needs to find some shelter. So these are all characteristics of the Lucena position, mainly this pawn on d7. Now, how do we win here? We know that what black will try to do is give us checks or try to go to d1 in order to defend the promotion square. And this position is black to move. If it was white to move, white would just simply make a queen and win the game. But of course, black will simply try to give us checks or do something in order to put up a resilient fight. Now, before I move on to the winning technique here and before I explain how to win this position, I want to define certain terms. As you can see on the board, we have an extra d pawn. Any pawn on the chessboard splits the board into two parts. The side that has less squares is the short side. So as you can see, ABC in this case is the short side, and the other side from E to H is the long side. If the pawn was on G7, for example, or let's say F7 instead, this would be the long side and this would be the short side. So that's what this means. This is going to become relevant in a moment and throughout the entire video. In this case, the king is on the long side and the rook is on the short side, which is bad for the black pieces. I will explain why, but for now, let's describe the winning technique for the white pieces. So in this case, what the winning technique is that after black gives us a couple of checks, rook d1 doesn't do anything, by the way. We just go king c7 and do the same technique anyways. But rook c1 check. And what we want to do is first and foremost, make sure that the enemy rook is not giving us any checks. So we go king b7, king c8, and we hide our own king in front of the pawn. Now here we face a problem with the white pieces, and because our king cannot move, we need to be able to move our king away in order to promote this pawn. And black has two ways to continue here, and we're going to discuss both. Black can either stay on the c file and control the c file in general, or black can move away from the c file and try to give us checks from the side. Now, let's say black does that instead, because that's easier to explain, so I will start with that. Let's say black goes rook h1. Here we use this technique, which I like to call covering. It's not an official name, this is just what I like to call it. We want to put the rook on c2, and we want to put the rook on the opposite side of our opponent's king, because now we are covering the entire c file, and if the rook gives us check, we can find shelter here, and next move we can promote. If the king tries to get close, we give a check, force it to go back, we promote, and then we win this endgame. Rook and king versus king is a win, of course. Now, going back, in this position, a rook h1 is not the most resilient way to try to defend this position. Black can also try to stay on the c file instead and not allow our rook to move. Now what we want to do is force the king away from this f file and the e file as well. We want to give this check on f2. Now this check is very important, and the king has two potential moves. If the king comes closer to e6, attacking this pawn, once again we use the covering technique, but in this case the black king actually covers us, so there's no way to give checks here for the black rook, and then we can actually queen on the next move. Let's say rook d3, we make a queen, we win the game. There's no way to give a check on c8 because we would take the rook, and the position is simply winning. So that's the easy part. Now, let's say the black king instead goes away. Let's say it goes to g6. And now we employ this technique called building the bridge. So what we do is we need to put the rook on the 4th rank, rook to f4. For the black pieces, an equivalent of that would be the 5th rank, because the board would be switched over, but 4th rank from the bottom up, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we put the rook on the 4th rank, and what we want to do is move our king out of the way, and then eventually this rook will shield us. So here, let's say rook to d3 is played as an example. We can move out of the way in order to try to promote the queen. Black gives us checks, but we cannot block just yet because, of course, the black rook would take. We come forward, black gives us a check once again. We go over to the side, check, and then we go to d5. So look at what we did. We did a little bit of a zigzag here. So we started on e7, we went to d6, we didn't go to e5 right away, that would lose the pawn. We still need to maintain the defense of this pawn. Black gave us a check, and then we went to d5. And then once black gives a check on d3, now we can go rook to d4, takes, we are queening on the next move, king to f7, we make a queen, or if you're trying to be funny, you can make a rook and win this endgame instead. So that's what you can do in this position. Just remember this maneuver of bop, 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 and then rook blocks on f4, from f4 to d4, and the position is winning. And this is called building a bridge. And it only works when the king is cut off for 2 ranks. That's why we gave this check on f2 after rook c3. Remember, the bridge would not work here. The king is too close, we cannot get out, so we can't do it right away. We have to start with rook f2 and force the black king to make a decision. King comes closer, we make a queen this way by covering, using the cover technique. And if the king goes away, now we can go rook f4. Now we can build the bridge and then win the game, just like so. So remember this technique of building the bridge. Check and rook to d4. Now, Lucena is not always winning. There is one and only one case, as far as I know, that is a draw for the side that is trying to defend. Remember earlier I was talking about the short side and the long side. So this pawn right here splits the board in 2 parts. This is the short side. Once again, I'm just repeating what I said earlier. This right here in the red square rectangle is the long side. In order for Lucena defense to fail and your opponent to actually defend the position and not win the game, this has to be the piece configuration. The black king, or the defending king, has to be on the short side, and the defending rook, the black rook, has to be on the long side, 3 squares away from the pawn. 3 squares, 3 files, I should say. 3 files away from the pawn, because the rook is on the h file, the pawn is on the d file, and there are 3 files separating the d and h file. And this is a draw because the black rook can keep giving checks, and the white king is unable to actually move away from the pawn and find some shelter, because the white rook is over here, and the white rook is doing a job of just cutting the king off. The black rook has to keep giving checks, and it just keeps giving checks, and the white king cannot get closer, because if it does, the pawn is lost. This way the pawn is lost as well, so the white king has to keep an eye on this pawn. You just keep giving checks. As soon as this king starts to just get close, you can even do something like this and then win the pawn. So this position is a draw, and this is the only case it's a draw. If the king is on the long side in this position, let me just go back to the starting position. This position right here is winning. Why? Because the king is on the long side. The defending king is on the long side, and the defending rook is on the short side. So this is the wrong piece configuration for black in order to try to defend this position. Here, it is the correct piece configuration. The black king is on the short side, the black rook is on the long side. Now, if we were to move this black rook 1 square to the left, this would also be losing for the black pieces. So let's just get the same exact position. As you can see, it's the same exact position, except we move the rook 1 square to the left. But now this is winning because the pawn and the rook are not separated by 3 files. They're only separated by 2 files, and this is simply not enough, because after rook g8 check, and then check here. Once again, we do this small bridge building technique. We don't go to f6 right away, that would lose the pawn. We defend, and now once we are given a check on g6, now we can go king to f7. On the next move, we will promote the pawn. Now, there is some stuff here. For example, if our opponent plays a move like rook to d6, of course, this doesn't work because we go king e7. Let's say the rook goes back. It has to move somewhere. We queen, and this endgame is once again winning. So that is the Lucena position. Those are all the major details in the Lucena. Now let's move on to when the pawn is on the 6th rank instead of the 7th rank. Okay, now let's move on to a different scenario where the pawn is not on the 7th rank, but on the 6th rank. So what changes here and what does this mean? There are two very important factors to consider when trying to determine whether this position is a win or a draw. So first and foremost, we need to identify which pawn the attacking side has. In this case, the white side has the knight's pawn. And also the second factor is the placement of the rook. I will get into that a bit more later on. But first of all, let's talk about the pawn placement specifically and why knight's pawn is a draw and why other pawns might be winning. First of all, if you have a rook's pawn or a knight's pawn, so either A, B, G, H, this position will be a draw, and the defensive technique here is just a very simple passive defense, which just basically means moving the rook back and forth. You just basically move the rook back and forth, and there's nothing that white can do. White cannot make any progress. If white gives a check, you hide in the corner, and once again you go back and forth with the king. There is absolutely zero way for white to make progress. If white pushes a pawn, it's still a draw because there's nothing that white can do here. You just keep moving back and forth, and then, yeah, there's no way to make progress. But if instead of a knight's pawn, this is a bishop's pawn, now the situation is different and it becomes a bit more nuanced. The same thing applies to the central pawns as well. So what are the nuances that we need to look out for here? If this rook was over here somewhere on b1, let's say, and the position was black to move, this is actually a draw. And we will see that in the Philidor defense case because we would be giving checks from behind. So let me just make a couple of wasteful moves, just two wasteful moves right here. I know this is checkmate, but I just want to get to this position. This is a draw. So the rook needs to be on the first rank or just far away. And then the rook also needs to give checks from behind. So you would go rook to g1, rook to f1, and just keep giving checks. And then once the king gets too close, now you can even win the pawn if the king goes too far away. So that would be the defensive technique here. However, that doesn't work in this case because black does not have enough time to do that. And the passive defense also doesn't work because of this sequence of moves that I'm about to show you. So white to play and win. The correct move here, there's a couple of moves, but rook to g7 is the correct technique. Now, it doesn't actually matter where the black king goes because both lines just sort of transpose into one another. If the king goes to h8, we give a check on h7 and we force the king back to g8. If the king goes to f8, we still go rook h7 because we're still threatening checkmate on the 8th rank, and black still has to play this move or go here and then lose the rook. So let's just say this is the position. Now we can push the pawn. Now we can give a check on the 8th rank and we win the rook and we win the game. And this is the winning idea for the white pieces, and it works because there's enough room to create this maneuver. If we go back, there's not enough room in the knight's pawn in order to do that, because if the black rook just moves, check here, you cannot go off the edge of the board. That's not possible, right? If you could go to like LMN files, then you could give a check and maybe win this rook on c8, but you cannot do that in chess, unfortunately. So you just have to accept the draw if you're in this position with the white pieces. So if it's a bishop's pawn, it is winning because of that maneuver right there. And if it's a king and queen pawn, it's also winning, but it's a bit more nuanced because there's an easy way to win and then there's a difficult way to win. If you go rook to f7, the problem is there's this very pesky idea. You cannot just simply go over here. You can go rook h7 as well, to be fair, but you still get into the same position. But the thing is, this king will run to the corner, and then if you try to push, there's a check, and there's a way to blunder this. If you go king to f7, for example, this is a draw because of this crazy move rook to f6. So this is a bit of a theoretical nuance that I wanted to include. If you capture the rook, of course it's a stalemate and the position ends up in a draw. So the correct move here is to actually go to not here, sorry. The correct move here is to go king g5 away and then sacrifice the rook and then make a queen here instead. That's the winning technique. And then you have to win queen versus rook, which is also a challenge on its own. But if you know the technique here, this position is also theoretically winning for the side with the queen. It's just you need to know the technique, and it's a bit more work. However, if we go back, there's actually a very easy way to win this. Instead of rook to f7, you can go rook a1 and then go rook h1 in order to threaten checkmate from far away. And after a move like king g8, you go rook to g1 check, king, force the king back pretty much. Now you give a check, and now once again you go to g8. So it's actually a very similar technique, except you just go a bit far away. If you go from here, you get attacked, and it's a bit uncomfortable because the king will just run to the corner. But if you're far away, this rook will not be hanging in some lines because the king is not forced to defend it. So it's just a bit more convenient to do this from the first rank instead of doing it on the 7th rank because the rook is far away, it's not under attack. So that's just a slight theoretical nuance which I wanted to include, but of course this position is winning as well for the side that has the pawn, and the rook pawn is actually the simplest one. The rook pawn, it's just this. You just keep giving checks with the black pieces, or even the passive defense here with just keeping the rook on the 8th rank. This also works, and then you can just keep going back and forth, keep going back and forth, and this position is also a draw. There's one more nuance which I want to include. Let's say it's a bishop's pawn or a central pawn, for example. If the king is over here, let me just set up the position in a different way. If the king is over here on the long side, this could be a draw in some cases, and in this case it is. And the rook is also on this side of the board. Let me just make one more move. As I said, you can keep giving checks from behind, and this is a draw. Okay, now let's talk about the actual Philidor defense. In this position, there are two defensive techniques. One of them is the Philidor defense with rook to b6, which is also called the 6th rank or the 3rd rank defense. Or in this case, because it's a knight's pawn, we can also employ the passive defense with rook to b8. So we can just keep going back and forth, keep going back and forth. White will try to push this pawn, but as we know, we already learned this a couple of minutes ago, this position is a draw because it's a knight's pawn. So this is one of the defensive techniques that we can employ here, but there's also another one, and I will actually show it to you in a case where the passive defense doesn't work. Here we cannot go rook to b8, and we cannot stay on the 8th rank. It's a bishop's pawn, so we cannot afford to do that. Instead, what we need to do is we need to know the Philidor defensive technique. It works in this case as well, the knight's pawn. So I do suggest practicing this one a little bit more because it's a very important defensive maneuver. So in the Philidor defense, first and foremost, the king needs to be in front of the pawn. Our king, which is the defensive king as the black pieces, needs to be in front of the pawn. We cannot be allowing white's king to get over here on f7, for example, somehow. That would run into Lucena, and then white is the one who's pushing the position for a win. But if it's a Philidor position, the king needs to be on this square in front of the pawn, and you need to try to get this if you're playing with the black pieces, meaning if you're on the defensive side. So in this case, what we want to do is put the rook on the 6th rank. This is why it's called the 6th rank defense, because we put the rook on the 6th rank and we cut the king off from going over there. So let's say white just goes back and forth, like we can also just chill out on the 6th rank. Nothing happens here. If white gives us checks, once again we go back and forth and nothing happens here. There's no way for white to make any progress. Now the only way white can try to make any progress, because we know the rook moves don't do anything. The rook checks on the 8th rank and the 7th rank don't do anything. We go back and forth. What white needs to do is push this pawn. This is the only way to make progress here. There's no other way. Once white pushes the pawn, now we go as far away as possible. We go to b1, okay? And our goal is going to be to give checks from behind. If the white rook gives us checks, once again, we go back and forth. If the white king comes up, now we keep giving checks. And this is the whole defensive technique with the Philidor. If the king goes too far away, we can even target the pawn and even win the pawn. Let's say the pawn is pushed. We can now capture it, and this position is, of course, a draw, rook versus rook. And it's a very, just a very easy draw. So we just keep giving checks, and there's nothing that white king can do. And that's about it. That's the whole Philidor defense technique. It's not that complicated. You know, sometimes people throw out a lot of terms and a lot of names, and it can get a little bit complicated. For example, in Lucena, you need to know some names like short side, long side, stuff like that. In the Philidor defense, you just have to cut the king off on the 6th rank. Once the pawn goes there, now you keep giving checks from behind, and it is basically going to be a perpetual draw. Let me show you this position as well. Same thing applies here, except it's just a different pawn. You go rook to h6 in this case, 6th rank defense. Let's say white goes here. You just go with the rook. Don't even touch the king. Just move the rook. Just move the rook back and forth. If the rook gives you a check, once again the king goes back and forth. Now here, once white pushes, now you go to h1 and you start giving checks from the behind, and this position is a draw. There is absolutely no way for white to make any progress here, and the position just simply ends up being a draw. Something like this. So that's going to be it for today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. Also, let me know what endgames you want to see. And yeah, that's about it. Peace.